The snow was falling softly over the colony world of New Virginia on Christmas Eve in the year 2847. The white flakes drifted down from a dark sky filled with distant stars, covering the small military housing units in a blanket of peaceful silence. It was the kind of night that made people forget about wars and politics and the cruel realities of living under alien rule. General Catherine Monroe stood at her kitchen window, watching the snow pile up on the windowsill. She was 47 years old, with gray streaks running through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of too many battles and too little sleep. Tonight, however, she was not thinking about battles. Tonight she was just a mother. In the living room behind her, she could hear her two sons laughing. Danny was 14, tall for his age, with the same stubborn jaw that his father had worn before a council bombing raid took him 5 years ago. Lucas was 11, still round-faced and innocent, still believing that the universe could be a kind place if you just hoped hard enough. They were decorating a small pine tree that Catherine had grown in the hydroponic bay. Real trees were rare on colony worlds, and this one had taken her 3 years to cultivate. But it was worth it for the looks on her boys' faces as they hung the ornaments, each one a memory, each one a tiny piece of earth they had never seen. Catherine had requested leave for the first time in 6 years. She was one of the highest-ranking human officers in the Defense Force, and she had not taken a single day off since her husband's death. But this year was different. This year she had promised herself one Christmas with her children, just one night of peace before she went back to the endless war of survival that defined human existence in the galaxy. She poured herself a cup of coffee, walked into the living room. Danny was lifting Lucas up so he could place a star on top of the tree. The star was made of folded paper, something Lucas had crafted himself in school. It was crooked and slightly torn, but Catherine thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Mom, look," Lucas called out when he saw her. "I did it. I put the star up." Catherine smiled, feeling something warm spread through her chest. "It looks perfect, sweetheart. Your father would have loved it." Danny set his brother down and turned to look at her. There was something old in his eyes, something that should not have been there in a 14-year-old. He had seen too much, understood too much about the universe they lived in. "Mom, do you think the council will leave us alone tonight? Just for one night?" Catherine opened her mouth to answer, to offer some comfort, some reassurance, but the words never came. The transport beam cut through the ceiling at exactly 2,147 hours. There was no warning, no sound, just a sudden column of blue light that sliced through the roof of their home like it was made of paper. Catherine reached for the sidearm she always kept at her hip, but her hand never made it. A paralysis field locked onto her body, freezing every muscle in place. She could not move. She could not speak. She could only watch two figures materialized in her living room. They were Velthari, one of the ruling species of the Galactic Concul. They stood 7 feet tall, their bodies covered in crystalline armor that seemed to grow from their very skin. Their faces were flat and expressionless, their eyes like polished stones that reflected nothing. By order of the Galactic Concul, one of them announced in a cold, translated voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "The offspring of Catherine Monroe, human military designation General 7, are hereby seized as collateral against humanity's outstanding compliance debts." Catherine screamed inside her frozen body. She screamed until she thought her mind would break, but no sound escaped her paralyzed throat. She could only watch as the Velthari turned toward her sons. Danny moved first. He threw himself at the nearest alien, fists swinging wildly, putting his body between the enforcers and his little brother. He was brave, so impossibly brave. And Catherine's heart shattered as she watched him fight. The Velthari did not even acknowledge his attack. It simply raised one hand, and a containment field wrapped around Danny, lifting him off the ground like he weighed nothing. Lucas tried to run, tried to reach his mother, but the second enforcer caught him in an identical field. "Mom," Lucas screamed, his voice high and terrified. "Mom, help us. Please help us." Danny was struggling against the field, still fighting, still trying to protect his brother, even though he could not move. "Leave him alone. Take me. Just take me. He's just a kid." The Velthari ignored them both. They turned toward the transport beam, carrying the two boys like they were cargo, like they were nothing more than items to be collected and catalogued. Catherine watched her sons rise into that column of blue light. She watched their faces, Danny's twisted with fury, Lucas's streaked with tears. She watched them reach for her, their hands stretching out across the impossible distance between them. "Mom?" Lucas screamed one last time. "Mommy." And then they were gone. The light vanished. The Valkyrie vanished. The paralysis field released her, and Catherine Monroe fell to her knees on the floor of her ruined home. The Christmas tree had been knocked over in the struggle. Ornaments lay scattered across the floor, some of them broken, some of them rolling slowly in the silence. The paper star had fallen from the top of the tree and lay crumpled near her hand. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The universe did not care about human tragedy. Catherine stayed on that floor, on her knees, for exactly 4 minutes. She let herself feel it all, the grief, the rage, the terrible helplessness of a mother who had failed to protect her children. She let the tears stream down her face. She let the pain wash through her like fire. Then she wiped her eyes. She picked up the crumpled paper star and smoothed it out carefully, gently, like it was the most precious thing in the world. She placed it in her pocket, close to her heart. General Catherine Monroe stood up. The Galactic Council had ruled the known universe for 11,000 years. They had conquered or destroyed 412 species. They had built an empire that stretched across 3 galactic arms, and they had maintained that empire through fear and force and the absolute certainty that no one could ever challenge. They had never faced a human mother who had. Nothing left to lose. Catherine walked to her communication console and began making calls. She called Admiral Patricia Dunn, the oldest serving officer in the human fleet. She called Commander Benjamin Torres, the tactical genius who had survived the impossible. She called every ally, every friend, every person who had ever lost someone to the Council's compliance seizures. She told them the same thing she told herself. Standing in the ruins of Christmas, with her son's laughter still echoing in her ears. The Council had made a mistake tonight. They had taken the wrong mother's children, and they were going to learn. All of them, every species in that vast and ancient empire, exactly what that mistake was going to cost them. The last war was about to begin. 3 days after Christmas, Catherine Monroe stood before the United Human Assembly on Earth. The great chamber was built deep underground, hidden from Council surveillance satellites, protected by layers of rock and metal and desperate human engineering. It was the largest gathering of human leadership in 30 years, and every seat was filled. Representatives had come from every colony world. Military commanders had traveled from distant outposts. Scientists had left their research stations. Diplomats had abandoned their useless negotiations. They had all come because they had heard what happened on New Virginia. They all knew that something was about to change. Catherine stood at the central podium, looking out at the sea of faces before her. Some of them she knew personally. Others she had never met. But all of them shared the same expression, a mixture of fear and hope and anger that had been building for 300 years. Behind her, a holographic display showed a star map of Council space. The territory was vast beyond human comprehension, stretching across 3 galactic arms, containing millions of star systems and trillions of beings. The human sector was a tiny dot at the edge of that map, barely visible, easily ignored. "They took my sons," Catherine said, her voice carrying through the silent chamber. "On Christmas Eve, while we decorated a tree and tried to pretend that we were safe, the Valkyrie came into my home and stole my children." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But this is not about my sons. This is about the 17,000 human children currently held in Council compliance facilities across the galaxy. This is about the tribute ships we send every year, filled with our people's labor and our people's lives. This is about 300 years of humanity bending its knee to species that see us as animals, as tools, as something to be used and discarded." Admiral Patricia Dunn rose from her seat in the front row. She was 73 years old, with white hair and a face like weathered stone. She had served in the human fleet for 50 years. and she had watched friends and family disappear into council custody more times than she could count. "General Monroe," she said, her voice careful and measured, "what exactly are you proposing?" "We have 47 combat vessels. The council has millions. We cannot fight a war we cannot win." Catherine nodded slowly. She had expected this question. She had been preparing for it her entire life. "I am not proposing a war we can win through force," she said. "The Admiral is correct. If we meet the Council in open battle, we will be destroyed. They have the ships, the weapons, the numbers. By every military calculation, we should surrender now and hope for mercy." She touched a control and the star map shifted. Lines appeared across Council space, showing trade routes and supply chains and the complex web of relationships that held the Empire together. But the Council is not just a military power. It is an economic system. It is a political arrangement. It is a set of assumptions and habits that have not been challenged in 6,000 years. And that is their weakness. Dr. Linda Park stood up from her seat near the back of the chamber. She was a xenobiologist, one of the foremost experts on council species in human space. She had spent decades studying their cultures, their psychology, their hidden fears and desires. "The general is correct," Linda said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber. "The council has not faced a real threat in millennia. Their military doctrine was developed against enemies that no longer exist. Their technology has advanced, but their thinking has remained the same. They respond to challenges the way they always have, because that way has always worked. And how does that help us?" Someone called out from the crowd. Linda smiled grimly. "Because humans are different. We have only been spacefaring for 4 centuries, and in that time, we have faced extinction 3 times. We have lost colonies, lost wars, lost everything, and rebuilt from nothing. The Council thinks we are primitive because we are young. They do not understand that our youth is our strength. We adapt. We change. We find new ways to survive when the old ways fail." Catherine gestured to the map again. "The Council expects us to fight a conventional war. They expect us to throw our ships against their fleets, to die heroically and uselessly, to provide them with a quick victory they can celebrate. We are going to give them something completely different." In the weeks that followed, Catherine assembled her command staff in a bunker beneath the Martian surface. The facility had been built in secret over 20 years, designed to be invisible to Council sensors. Powered by geothermal energy that left no detectable signature, Commander Benjamin Torres arrived first. He was a small man, with quick eyes and a mind that worked faster than any computer. 7 years ago, he had survived the Kepler massacre by hiding his ship inside a gas giant's storm band for 8 months. He had watched his entire fleet destroyed around him, had listened to his friends die over the radio, and had emerged with a hatred for the Council that burned like a cold star in his chest. Captain Samuel Green came next. His grandmother had been taken in a compliance seizure 40 years ago, and he had never forgotten. He had spent his entire career preparing for this moment, studying Council tactics, mapping their weaknesses, waiting for someone to finally say the words that Catherine had spoken. Dr. Linda Park brought her research. Decades of work on Council psychology and social structures. She understood how they thought, what they feared, and most importantly, what they could not imagine. They gathered around a planning table, the holographic map floating between them, and they began to design a war unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. "The first target is their economy," Catherine said. "We hit the financial relay stations. Not to destroy them, but to corrupt them. 300 years of records, trades, debts, all of it turned to chaos." Torres leaned forward, his eyes bright with understanding. "The Council is held together by money. Every species has obligations to every other species. If no one knows who owes what, the whole system freezes. And while they're trying to sort out their finances," Green added, "they won't be watching their slaves." Catherine nodded. "The second target is the transport ships. Every vessel carrying human prisoners gets one chance to surrender their cargo. If they refuse, we destroy them." Linda looked troubled. "There will be humans on those ships. Some of them will die." "Yes," Catherine said, and her voice did not waver. Some of them will die. But the Council needs to understand something that they have never understood before. We would rather burn than bow. We would rather lose everything than live as their property. That is what makes us dangerous. That is what makes us unstoppable. She looked around the table at her team, at the people who had chosen to follow her into the impossible. Operation Last Light begins in 30 days. When it is over, the galaxy will never be the same. The others nodded, their faces set with determination, outside the bunker. Mars turned slowly in the void, a red world circling a yellow sun, home to a species that refused to accept its place in the universe. The gathering was complete. The planning was done. Now came the war. The Galactic Council had ruled the known universe for 11,000 years, and in all that time, they had developed certain expectations about how conquered species behaved. First came anger, then resistance, then defeat, and finally acceptance. It was a pattern as old as the stars themselves, and it had never failed. High Admiral Vathos of the Kethrani. Dominion sat in his command chamber on the fortress world of Nexus Prime. Reviewing the latest intelligence reports on human activity, the Kethrani were one of the founding species of the Council. Ancient beings with tentacled bodies and minds that calculated probability with mathematical precision. Vathos had personally overseen the subjugation of 17 species during his career, and he considered himself an expert on the behavior of lesser races. The humans are mobilizing, his aide reported. Our sensors show increased activity around their military installations. Communication traffic has increased by 300%. Vathos waved a tentacle dismissively. Of course they are. The Monroe female lost her offspring. She will rage for a time, perhaps destroy a few outposts, and then we will crush whatever remains of their fleet. It is the natural order of things. He turned back to his calculations. Already composing the report he would send to the Council after the inevitable human defeat, the numbers were simple. 47 human ships against millions of Council vessels. The probability of human victory was so low that his mathematics could not even express it. What Vathos did not understand, what his calculations could not account for, was that Catherine Monroe had no intention of fighting the war he expected. On January 24th, 2848, at exactly 0300 hours Galactic Standard Time, 14 human strike teams launched simultaneous attacks across Council space. Their targets were not military installations. They were not defensive positions or weapons factories or fleet staging areas. They were financial relay stations. The Council's economy ran on information. Every trade, every debt, every obligation between species was recorded and transmitted through a network of relay stations that stretched across the galaxy. These stations were considered so essential, so untouchable, that they were barely defended. No species had ever been foolish enough to attack them, because doing so would harm everyone, including the attacker. Catherine Monroe did not care about everyone. She cared about winning. The strike teams did not destroy the stations. That would have been too simple, too easy to repair. Instead, they uploaded carefully designed viruses that corrupted the data in ways that would take decades to untangle. 300 years of financial records became meaningless. Trade agreements dissolved into confusion. Debts that had been owed for generations suddenly had no proof of existence. The galactic economy did not collapse. It simply stopped. This is an act of war against civilization itself. Ambassador Kethris, the Council's human liaison, transmitted in outrage. You have attacked civilian infrastructure. This is a crime under 17 different accords. Catherine's response was broadcast on every frequency humanity could access. Her face appeared on screens across the galaxy, calm and steady, showing no trace of the grief that burned inside her. We did not kill anyone, she said. We attacked your money. And now, every species in the Council is going to spend the next several years trying to figure out who owes what to whom. They are going to realize that the system that has been exploiting them might not be worth defending. She paused, letting her words sink in. This is not a war for territory. This is not a war for resources. This is a war for the soul of the galaxy, and we have only just begun. 8 hours later, the second phase of Operation Last Light began. Human ships appeared throughout Council space, not in fleets designed for battle, but in small groups positioned near slave transport vessels. These were the ships that carried human prisoners from their homes to compliance facilities. The ships that had taken 17,000 children from their families. Every transport received the same message: release your human cargo to the nearest human colony, or face destruction. 17 transports complied immediately. Their crews were not soldiers. They were merchants and bureaucrats, people who had taken the job because it paid well and seemed safe. When faced with actual combat, they chose survival over loyalty to the Council. 43 transports refused. Some were crewed by true believers in Council authority. Others simply did not believe that humans would actually fire on ships, carrying their own people. They were wrong. Catherine gave the order herself. Sitting in the command chair of her flagship, while the tactical display showed 43 red dots scattered across the stars, she thought about Danny and Lucas, wondered if they were on one of those ships, wondered if she was about to kill her own sons. She gave the order anyway. "Fire," she said, and her voice did not shake. The transports died in flashes of light visible across light years. Some of them tried to run. Some of them tried to fight back. None of them survived. Human prisoners died on those ships. Catherine knew this. She had calculated the cost before she ever launched the operation. But she also knew that the Council needed to understand something fundamental about the species. They had tried to enslave. Humanity would rather die free than live in chains. They would rather burn their own people than let them remain property. This was not logic. This was not strategy. This was the deepest truth of the human soul. Forged in millions of years of evolution, on a harsh world where survival always demanded sacrifice, the galaxy watched in horror and fascination as humans proved that they were exactly as dangerous as they had always claimed to be. Reports flooded into Vathas's command chamber, each one more impossible than the last. Financial systems in chaos, slave ships destroyed. Human forces appearing and disappearing across Council space like ghosts, striking targets that no one had thought to defend. "This is not possible," Vathos said, his tentacles writhing in agitation. "These are primitive creatures. They cannot coordinate attacks across this distance. They cannot have this many ships." But they did not have many ships. They had 31 combat vessels, barely a fraction of the Council's military might. What they had was something Vathos could not calculate, something his mathematics could not express. They had a mother who wanted her children back. They had 300 years of rage finally set free. They had nothing left to lose. In her quarters that night, Catherine Monroe sat alone in the darkness, holding the crumpled paper star that Lucas had made for their Christmas tree. She thought about the people who had died today, humans and aliens alike. She thought about the chaos she had unleashed, the suffering that was still to come. She thought about her sons, somewhere in the vastness of space, waiting for her to find them. "I'm coming," she whispered to the empty room. "I promise. I'm coming." Outside her window, the stars burned cold and bright, witnesses to the birth of a war that would reshape the galaxy forever. 6 months into the war, the galaxy had become a very different place. The Council had responded to humanity's attacks with overwhelming force, just as High Admiral Vathos had promised. 12 human colony worlds had been reduced to ash, their populations either dead or scattered across the stars. The human fleet had lost half its vessels in desperate holding actions and strategic retreats. Earth itself had been bombarded from orbit. And though the planetary defense grid had held, millions had died in the attacks. By any reasonable measure, humanity was losing. The numbers did not lie. For every Council ship destroyed, 10 human lives were lost. For every victory Catherine's forces won, 3 defeats followed. The mathematics of war were simple and brutal. They did not favor the smaller side, but something strange was happening across the galaxy. Something the Council had not anticipated and could not understand. Other species were watching. They had been watching since the first human attack on the financial relay stations. They had watched humans destroy their own people rather than leave them in slavery. They had watched a species outnumbered millions to one refuse to surrender, refuse to bend, refuse to accept the fate that the Council had assigned them. And slowly, quietly in the dark corners of 1,000 worlds, they had started to remember. The Telvanni were the first to reach out. They were a race of crystalline beings, their bodies made of living mineral that sang with frequencies beyond human hearing. They had been Council subjects for 3,000 years. Ever since their homeworld had been conquered in a war, they had never wanted to fight. In all that time, they had been model citizens, compliant and productive, never causing trouble, never questioning their place in the galactic order. Their representative arrived on Mars under a flag of negotiation. The being called itself simply Glass, a name that meant something profound in the Telvanni language, but translated poorly to human speech. It stood in Catherine's command bunker, light refracting through its crystalline form, creating rainbows on the metal walls. "We have watched humans," Glass said, its voice like wind chimes in a storm. "We have watched you lose and lose and lose again. We have watched you sacrifice your own people. We have watched you refuse to surrender, even when surrender is the only logical choice." Catherine stood across from the alien, her face showing nothing of the exhaustion that weighed on her bones. "And what do you think of what you have seen?" "We think it is madness," Glass replied. "It is not logical. It is not efficient. It is not how survival works in this galaxy." "Then why are you here?" The crystalline being was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, its voice had changed, becoming softer, almost sad. "Our children were taken too," Glass said. "Long ago, when we first became subjects of the Council, they told us it was for our own good. They told us compliance was survival. They told us to forget our anger, to accept our place, to be grateful for the peace they provided." The alien's form shifted, light dancing through its structure in patterns that seemed almost like tears. "We believed them. We made ourselves believe them. For 3,000 years we have told ourselves that this was the only way, that resistance was futile, that our children were better off wherever the Council had taken them." Glass looked at Catherine with eyes that had seen millennia pass. "Your species has reminded us that we once knew how to be angry. You have reminded us that there are things worth dying for. You have reminded us that compliance is not survival. It is surrender. It is death of a different kind." Catherine felt something shift in her chest, a spark of hope she had not allowed herself to feel since the war began. "What are you offering?" she asked. "The Telvanni will rise," Glass said. "We do not know if we will win. We do not know if we will survive. But we know that we cannot watch any longer. We cannot pretend that we are content while human mothers fight to save their children, and we do nothing to save our own." Within 3 months, the Telvanni uprising had begun. It was small at first, scattered acts of sabotage and resistance on worlds across Council space. The Council responded with brutal efficiency, crushing the rebellion wherever it appeared, making examples of those who dared to challenge their authority. But every act of suppression created 10 new rebels. Every public execution reminded the Telvanni why they had decided to fight. The uprising did not grow, despite the Council's response. It grew because of it, and then came the Morvathi. They were an insectoid species. Billions of workers who had been forced into industrial labor for millennia. They built the Council's ships, manufactured their weapons, maintained the infrastructure that kept the Empire running. They were considered so completely controlled, so thoroughly broken, that the Council had stopped posting guards at their work colonies generations ago. That was a mistake. The Morvathi did not rise in open rebellion. They simply stopped working. Across 1,000 worlds, factories went silent. Assembly lines ground to a halt. Ships sat unfinished in orbital docks while their insectoid builders stood motionless, waiting. "We have built your weapons for 10,000 years, the Morvathi transmitted to the Council. We will not build them any longer. Not until you free the humans. Not until you free us all." Then came the Selthan, whose entire homeworld had been converted into a mining operation. Then the Karathi, who had been used as soldiers in council wars for generations. Then a dozen other species, each with their own grievances, their own stolen children, their own reasons to finally stop pretending that everything was fine. Commander. Torres showed Catherine the intercepted council communications, his face showing the first genuine smile she had seen from him in months. They are calling it the Awakening, he said. Every sector is reporting unrest. The Kathrani are demanding more ships to suppress the rebellions. The Velthri want to negotiate. The council itself is fracturing over how to respond. Catherine looked at the data, at the spreading chaos that had begun with one mother's refusal to accept the unacceptable. She thought about Danny and Lucas, still somewhere in council space, still waiting for her. It is not enough, she said quietly. The council is wounded, but it is not dead. Given time, they will adapt. They will find new ways to suppress the rebellions. They will wait us out. She turned to face her command staff, the people who had followed her into this impossible war. We need to end this. Not in decades. Not in years. Now, we need to strike at the heart of the council itself. Torres frowned. Nexus Prime? That is the most heavily defended position in the galaxy. They have 2 million ships stationed there. I know, Catherine said. That is why we are going to attack it. The room fell silent. Everyone present understood what she was proposing. It was not a battle plan. It was a death sentence. But they also understood something else. They understood that this war had never been about winning in the traditional sense. It had been about showing the galaxy that there was another way. That submission was not the only option, that even the smallest species could choose to fight. If they died at Nexus Prime, they would die proving that point. And maybe, just maybe, their deaths would mean something. When do we leave? Torres asked finally. Catherine looked at the star map, at the tiny dot that represented the heart of council power. Tomorrow, she said. We leave tomorrow. The Battle of Nexus Prime would be remembered for 1,000 generations as the moment when everything changed. Nexus Prime was not a natural world. It was a construction, an artificial planet built at the heart of council space over the course of 5,000 years. Its surface was covered entirely in cities and government complexes, home to the ruling classes of a dozen species. At its core was the council chamber itself, the place where the fate of the galaxy had been decided for millennia. The defensive fleet surrounding Nexus Prime was the largest ever assembled in galactic history. 2 million ships from every council species hung in the void, their weapons charged, their crews ready. They had been waiting for weeks. Ever since intelligence reports suggested that the human rebel would attempt something desperate, High Admiral Vathos commanded the defense from his flagship. Watching the empty space where his sensors predicted the human fleet would emerge, his calculations showed that any attack on Nexus Prime was suicide. The humans had 31 ships remaining. Against 2 million, they would last approximately 7 minutes. Contact, his sensor officer reported. Human vessels emerging from hyperspace at the system's edge. Vathos leaned forward, his tentacles curling with anticipation. How many? 31 ships, Admiral. 1 carrier-class vessel, and 30 support craft, exactly as predicted. Vathos felt something that might have been disappointment. He had hoped in some small way that the humans would surprise him one last time. Instead, they had come to die exactly as he had calculated. Open a communication channel, he ordered. I want to offer them surrender one final time. For the historical record, Catherine Monroe's face appeared on his display screen. She looked tired, worn down by months of war and loss and impossible choices, but her eyes were still bright with something Vathos could not identify. It was not fear. It was not despair. It was something alien to his understanding, something that made his mathematical mind deeply uncomfortable. Human vessels, Vathos said. You are ordered to surrender immediately. You cannot win this engagement. Your destruction is assured. Show wisdom for once in your species' brief existence. Catherine smiled at him. It was a small smile, sad and knowing and it made Vathos want to increase the distance between his ship and hers. "May I respond on an open channel?" she asked. "I have something I would like to say." Vathos hesitated. There was no tactical reason to allow it. But there was also no tactical reason to deny it. The battle's outcome was already determined. "Granted," he said. Catherine's image was broadcast to every ship in the system, every station, every world that could receive a transmission. Her voice reached trillions of beings across the galaxy, carried on waves of light that had been traveling since before her species existed. "My name is Catherine Monroe," she said. 8 months ago, your council took my sons from me on Christmas Eve. They came into my home, paralyzed me, and stole my children while I could do nothing but watch." She paused, and the galaxy paused with her. "Danny and Lucas are still out there somewhere. In one of your facilities, being told that their mother abandoned them, being told that humanity is weak, that we will always bow, that resistance is futile." Catherine looked directly into the camera, and it seemed like she was looking at every being who could see her. "I am here to show my sons that their mother never stopped fighting. I am here to show every parent who ever lost a child to the council that we remember. We do not forget. We do not forgive. We do not give up." Vathos watched her with growing unease. This was not how defeated species behaved. This was not the desperation of the doomed. This was something else entirely. "What is she doing?" his aide asked nervously. "Do not know," Vathos admitted, "but I do not like it." The human ships were not moving to attack. They simply hung at the edge of the system, broadcasting. And then, suddenly, Vathos understood what they were really doing. Dr. Linda Park had spent 6 months developing the signal that the human fleet was now transmitting. It was not a weapon in any traditional sense. It was not a virus or a bomb or any kind of physical attack. It was simply a message sent directly to every non-ruling species serving in the Council fleet. The message was simple, for words that carried the weight of 300 years of human suffering. You do not have to die for them. You can come home. The mutinies began within minutes. A Morvathi crew on a Kethrani. Warships sealed their commanders in the cargo hold and began transmitting surrender signals. A Telvanni weapons officer on a Velthri cruiser overloaded the reactor and evacuated with the other slaves before the ship exploded. Across 2 million vessels, beings who had served the Council for generations suddenly remembered that they had been slaves, that their children had been taken. They had been waiting for exactly this moment. Without even knowing it, Vathos watched in horror as his perfectly calculated fleet tore itself apart. Ships fired on each other. Commanders screamed for order that would never come. The largest military force in galactic history dissolved into chaos in less than an hour. "This is impossible," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The probabilities." But probability had nothing to do with it. Catherine Monroe had not attacked the Council's ships. She had attacked their foundation. The assumption that conquered species would always remain conquered, that compliance was permanent, that fear would always triumph over hope. She had been wrong about many things during the war. She had made mistakes that cost lives. But she had been right about one fundamental truth. When you give people a reason to fight, when you show them that resistance is possible, when you prove that even the smallest species can stand against the largest empire, you light a fire that no amount of water can extinguish. The Battle of Nexus Prime lasted 3 days. By the end, the Council fleet had been reduced to scattered survivors fleeing to the outer territories. The artificial world itself had fallen to a combined force of humans, Telvanni, Morvathi, and a dozen other species who had finally chosen to be free. Catherine did not celebrate. She did not give speeches or accept congratulations. She left her flagship the moment the fighting ended and took a shuttle to Nexus Prime's 4th moon, where intelligence had located a compliance facility holding human children. She walked through the corridors of that facility alone. Past guards who had already surrendered, past administrative offices where records were being frantically destroyed. She walked until she reached a dormitory section. A long room filled with bunks and children who had been told their parents had abandoned them. Danny saw her first. He was standing at the far end of the room, taller than she remembered, older than he should have been. He had been taking care of the younger children, she learned later. He had organized them, kept them safe during the chaos, refused to let them give up hope. "Mom?" he said, his voice cracking. "Mom, is that really you?" Lucas came running from somewhere behind him, pushing past the other children. His face streaked with tears he was too young to be ashamed of. "Mommy," he screamed. "Mommy, you came?" "You came." Catherine dropped to her knees and caught them both in her arms. She held them so tightly that she thought she might never let go. She felt their hearts beating against hers, felt their breath on her neck, felt the weight of 8 months of fear and grief and desperate hope finally lifting from her shoulders. "I told you," she whispered, her own tears falling freely. "I told you I would come. I promised." Danny was shaking in her arms, the brave front he had maintained for months finally crumbling. "They told us you were dead. They told us you had given up." "Never," Catherine said. "I would never give up on you. Not ever. Not as long as I breathe." Outside the facility, the galaxy was being reborn. The council had collapsed, surviving leaders fleeing to the outer territories, where they would spend the rest of their days hiding from the species they had once ruled. In its place, something new was growing. A federation of free peoples built on principles humanity had carried from Earth: liberty, self-determination, the right of every being to live without chains. It would take decades to build. There would be conflicts and setbacks, and moments when the whole thing seemed ready to fall apart. But the foundation had been laid. The impossible had become possible. And at the center of it all was a simple truth that the council had never understood. Parents will do anything for their children. They will fight when fighting is hopeless. They will sacrifice when sacrifice is certain. They will tear down empires and reshape galaxies, not for power or glory or revenge, but simply because their children are waiting for them to come home. Years later, on a rebuilt colony world called New Virginia, Catherine Monroe decorated a Christmas tree with her sons. The snow fell softly outside, just as it had on that night when everything changed. Danny was grown now, with children of his own. Lucas had become a diplomat, working to maintain the peace their mother's war had made possible. Catherine hung the last ornament, a crumpled paper star that she had carried in her pocket through 8 months of war. It was faded and worn, barely whole,